Thank you. Good to be with you. I hope you've all got a handout. I have an old-fashioned sense that I like a handout because that means that technology can't go wrong at the last moment. I hope it makes it easier to follow what I'm saying. Also, should the thought enter your mind, how long, O Lord, you'll have some sense of where we are. And if the content might be helpful for your own preaching, then you can, stuff the handout in a commentary somewhere for future reference. Part of the point of starting the day with the scripture reading is, as it were, to stand back a bit from a lot of the specifics of church planting and related issues, and remind ourselves of the bigger context within which we operate, the good purposes of our God, and his ways and priorities for us. So I'd like to start this morning with a reading from the Old Testament. I have a sort of particular personal interest in the Old Testament, but also a sort of permanent sort of gripe and regret that so many churches don't seem to know what to do with the Old Testament anymore. My sense is that ministers are often lacking in confidence to handle it, and so they avoid it. And undoubtedly it is easy to misread, to get the wrong end of the stick. And the story we're going to look at is I think a prime example where often people say, well, isn't God nasty in the Old Testament? And this is one of those examples. So let's have a look at it. Before we get going, just a little reflection on what kind of material this Job story is. I'm not looking at the whole book of Job. I'm cheating. I'm just looking at the narrative that opens it, but it's fairly self-standing, so I think it's not too much of a cheat. And I've given you on the handout, it's a nice discussion from about 1.5 millennia ago, which is available it's a Jewish discussion available in Babylonian Talmud, where we find this. A certain rabbi was sitting before Rabbi Samuel ben Nachmani, and in the course of his expositions remarked, Job never was and never existed, but is only a typical figure. He, Samuel ben Nachmani, replied, to confute such as you, the text says, there was a man in the land of Uz. Job was his name. But, he retorted, if that is so, what of the verse, the poor man had nothing save one poor ewe lamb, which he had bought and nourished up, Nathan's parable to David? Is that anything but a parable? So this too is a parable? If so, said the other, why are his name and the name of his town mentioned? So you can see one sees it as parable. I mean, whether parable is actually the best term, you get the point for the kind of thing he's saying. While Samuel ben Nachmani insists that particularities of the text, the names of the person and the place, Job, Uz, indicate that he was a real historical figure. Now, my sense is both views can still be found today, though I think almost all scholars would favour the anonymous rabbi. The issue, however, is not one of rationalism, oh, that sort of thing couldn't possibly happen or whatever. It's literary judgment. We've got to read the text with full imaginative seriousness, and that does not preclude judgments about what kind of material it is that we read with full imaginative seriousness. Anyway, with those preliminaries, what I want to do now is to read the text and verse by verse and offer a running commentary. So I hope you've all got your biblical text available as Josh asked you to bring it along. There was once a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. That man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. A man in the land of Uz. Now, there has been much learned discussion as to where Uz might have been. But wherever Uz was, Uz is not Israel. That is the important thing. That is to say, Job is not an Israelite. He does not stand in the chosen, the promised line of Abraham and his descendants. He stands outside it, if he's from Uz. And that means that he probably represents a certain kind of everyman, or the issues of his story are those which should be meaningful and accessible to people independently of the special revelation of the Lord to Israel. It's also worth noting in that first verse the strength of Job's commendation. Blameless, upright, feared God, turned away from evil. I think that is the strongest commendation that anybody in the whole Old Testament receives. If you can find a stronger one, let me know. I think Job runs him a sort of a respectable second. Noah runs him a respectable second back in Genesis 6. But in terms of sort of strength of commendation, Job has it. And of the four things that are said about Job, blameless, upright, feared God, and turned from evil, the third term, feared God, is an important term because in the Old Testament, to fear God is the primary term the Old Testament has for appropriate human response to God. The fear of God plays the kind of role that the language of faith plays in the New. I mean, it isn't as dominant in the Old as the language of faith is in the New, but it's to do with right human response to God. And so it's not to do with being frightened of God, but responding rightly. And I mean, there isn't time to do a full study of that, but the famous story of Abraham and Isaac, the offering of Isaac, the climax of that, it's a test of Abraham, is, now I know that you are a God-fearer, since you've not withheld your son from me. One who fears God, or in Christian terms, a true believer. The Psalms regularly celebrate, blessed is the one who fears the Lord. Or in the New Testament, Mary in the Magnificat, who's speaking an Old Testament idiom, says his mercy is on those who fear him in every generation. You know, the natural Christian idiom is those who believe in him, those who trust in him, but Mary in Old Testament mode says his mercy is on those who fear him. So, you know, it's the term for right human response to God. So in verse 1, Job is a model of sort of right response to God. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. Job is fabulously well off. You'll see the numbers for his family and all his possessions. It's either 5 and 5 or 7 and 3. So they all add up to 10, i.e., you know, sort of large round numbers as a way of saying, you know, Job had it all. And if, you know, sort of lots of camels and donkeys don't quite, you know, sort of do it for the modern Western mind, I guess, you know, the equivalent will be, well, he had, you know, the mansion, the yacht, the airplane, you know, the Swiss bank accounts, you know, it's that kind of, you know, Job had it all. So verse 1, Job is exceptional in his piety. Verses 2 and 3, Job is exceptional in his prosperity. He's the one who's really got it all. And there is an important silence in the text about how these might or might not relate to one another. Note that the text simply puts them side by side. Outstanding, verse 1, and fabulously wealthy, verses 2 and 3. And that silence about how the two might relate, of course, can become an invitation to say, can we sort of probe the silence? Can we fill the gap and think about how perhaps they relate? And that we will see as we go on. Next two verses which talk about Job's exceptional care for his family. In verse 6, the scene dramatically changes from on earth to, as it were, in heaven. I'm using the NRSV, by the way, but it doesn't matter what translation you're using. One day, the heavenly beings, or sons of God, B'nai Elohim, came to present themselves before the Lord, and NRSV has Satan, capital S, also came among them. Here the NRSV, like the NIV and quite a lot of translations, is seriously misleading. Because Satan, capital S, is very hard to read without thinking of Satan the devil, when it's a proper name. And people often ask, well, what's Satan the devil doing in the presence of God in this kind of way? It seems kind of improper or problematic. To which the short answer is, it isn't Satan, capital S, the devil. And the reason it's not is a very simple one. And if you've got the NSV, you've got a footnote that tells you. There's a footnote, it says, or the accuser, Hebrew, ha, Satan. Now, ha in Hebrew is the definite article, the, and of course, proper names don't take the definite article. You don't say the Walter, the Josh, or whatever, you just use the name. The definite article, ha, the, is used for a role. The opponent, the obstructor, the person who asks hard questions. I.e., this is one of the heavenly beings who has a particular role, which is not Satan, and the particular role is, well, what we see from the story. That's all we know about this figure. So as we continue to read, I will, instead of saying Satan, that's the NRSV, I will say the Satan with lowercase s, though that won't be so obvious in my spoken address. So the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and the Satan also came among them. The Lord said to the Satan, "Where have you come from?" The Satan answered the Lord, "From going to and fro on the earth and from walking up and down on it." The Satan gets about, checks things out, knows what's going on. The Lord said to the Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil." Here the Lord picks up that initial, the narrator's commendation in verse 1, and underlines it. He not just repeats it, but says, there's no one like him on earth. He really is exceptional, paradigmatic. And he commends him, as it were, have you considered? Then the Satan answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a fence around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You've blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land." Now, note what the Satan is doing. The Satan is picking up that silence about the relationship between Job's piety and his prosperity at the outset, and is reading it suspiciously. He says there is a relationship between the two, and I'll tell you what it is. The one, the piety, is a means to the other. He's in it for what he gets out of it. I mean, he does so without a God. He'd be a mug not to, with all the wealth and everything that he's got. i.e., the Satan is saying that Job is, as it were, the religious equivalent of marrying someone for their money. Where, of course, the protestations may be full and glowing, and even the actions to try and persuade. But, of course, the goal is not the person, but their bank account. That's what you really want to get to. And that poses a real question. I mean, as you think of, if someone wants to marry you, I mean, we may never have been in that situation of someone wanting to marry someone, but at least we can imagine this. Are people genuinely what they appear to be, what they say they are, and even their actions may to some extent bear out? And the fact that this is a real question and not just a cynical one, I think can be seen if we sort of step sideways for a moment to the fact that there used to be an employee of the Vatican, I think he's been abolished, but he'd have been abolished, called the Devil's Advocate, whose job was to be part of the canonization procedures. When someone is proposed for being a saint, the Devil's Advocate was to ask hard questions. Is this person really what they appear to be? Because what you don't want to do is sort of, rush in, quick, oh, wonderful person, and declare them a saint. And then, an investigative journalist does some homework and says, but did you know about the mafia links and the slush funds and the sexual abuse or, whatever? Which was all sort of behind the scenes. And then there is a sort of shame and dismay everywhere, because among other things, being declared a saint means being declared a role model for other Christians. Now, it was Pope John Paul II who did away with the Devil's Advocate. I understand because he wanted to speed up the procedure, i.e. the problem with the canonization procedure is that it was so slow that, if you finally sort of made it, there would be no one alive who still remembered that person. He wanted saints from living memory who people could still know and in some sense relate to, and also to sort of to largen the range of names available on the principle that Catholic parents should give the name of a saint to their child. If you have more recent people and a wider range of names, then so much the better. So he worked to speed up the system, and goodbye Devil's Advocate. But anyway, the point is, that testing, does someone who looks the real deal, is that person the real deal? And that's the question that the Satan is putting here. Is Job what he really appears to be, or is he into God for what he gets out of God? So the Satan says, verse 11, but stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has, and he'll curse you to your face. Now, if the problem is a real one, as in being afraid if someone's marrying you for your money, how do you deal with it? Because it's absolutely no good whatever to say, no, he isn't. Yes, he is. No, he isn't. That gets precisely nowhere, claim or counterclaim. Should you be afraid that someone will marrying you for your money, there is only one absolute test, which is go broke and see if they stick around. And if they stick around, then you know. And so that is exactly what is being proposed in the text here. Stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has. Take away all that fabulous family and wealth in verses 2 and 3, and you'll see the real Job. And because, no, he isn't, yes, he is, gets nowhere, the Lord, as it were, has to accede to it. One has to go through with that test because it's the only test that will make absolutely clear where the real priorities lie. So the Lord said to the Satan, very well, all that he has is in your power, only do not stretch out your hand against him. So the Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. So the scene is set. which then leads to the next scene of a sort of stylized and slightly breathless account of all that happens to Job. One day, when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the eldest brother's house, setting the scene, a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were ploughing and the donkeys were feeding beside them, lovely rural idyllic pastoral scene, and the Sabaeans fell on them and carried them off and killed the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another came and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burnt up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another came and said, the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, formed 3 columns, made a raid on the camels and carried them off and killed the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another came and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. And suddenly a great wind came across the desert, struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they are dead. I alone have escaped to tell you. So in this slightly breathless sequence, everything that is specified in verses 2 and 3, Job's fabulous wealth, is taken away. So the moment of truth has arrived for Job. How will he respond? Then Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell on the ground. Thus far, that's sort of standard what you do in response to death and death-like situations in the ancient world. That's the normal sort of practice. And of course, we expect now the next thing is that Job will speak, and that speech will be the uttering of a cry of pain and lament in some form or other, that he will give voice to agony. Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell on the ground and worshipped, and said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Job responds not with a curse, but with a blessing. He sees everything as coming from God, belonging to God, and so ultimately going back to God. He blesses his name. i.e., in terms of the story, he continues his fear of God. He remains a God-fearer. He's into God, even though he's lost everything that he had. And that should surely be end of story. Goes past the test. Okay, fine. No. One day, the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. The Lord said to the Satan, where have you come from? The Satan answered the Lord, from going to and fro on the earth and from walking up and down on it, still checking things out. The Lord said to the Satan, have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. Thus far, it's verbatim identical, couple of minimal differences, but essentially identical to first time round. And now the Lord continues, he still persists in his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him for no reason. Now, 2 things to note there. The first, he still persists in his integrity. Now, the word the NRSV renders integrity is the noun from the same root as the adjective blameless that was used in chapter 1 when he was blameless and upright, tam or humar in the Hebrew. So it could be he persists in his blamelessness, i.e., the quality that Job was initially showing, he's still showing, though it's now not focusing anymore on the fear of God as such, but on one of the related things about his sort of right response to God. He still persists in his integrity, his blamelessness. Though you incite me against him to destroy him for no reason. Now, the for no reason, interesting, the Hebrew there, chinam, is the same as does Job fear God for no reason, chinam, back in 1:9. Now, of course, in one sense, we know there was a reason. It was a test. But the Lord's point is there was no reason in the sense that Job had done nothing wrong to deserve it. You know, there was no fault in Job, no defect in Job's relationship with God that made what's happened to him as sort of some sort of act of judgment or anything. The point is it was for no reason. He had done nothing to deserve it. And in that sense, it makes, you know, the sense is clear. What has happened to him, he'd done nothing wrong. Then the Satan answered the Lord, skin for skin. All that people have, they will give to save their lives. The Satan renews the suspicion and deepens it, takes it further. And the basis for this is a simple one. The first time round, the test was with regard to everything that Job had, specified in 1, 2, and 3. But the Lord said, only do not stretch out your hand against him when permission was given. And the Satan now picks that up. You exempted him in his person from any kind of loss or problem. But what if Job is not only self-seeking and self-serving in his relationship with God, but is ruthless about it as well? He doesn't care about anything or anyone else. They can go to hell for all he cares, as long as he in himself, number one, is still fine. All that people have, they will give to save their life. He can say goodbye happily to everything as long as it's still okay. So it's the same suspicion of self-serving, only a more ruthless kind of self-serving. So the Satan proposes a further test, but stretch out your hand now and touch, let him feel it in, his bone and his flesh, and he'll curse you to your face. Now, again, you know, sort of, no, he isn't, yes, he is, you know, gets precisely nowhere. The only way to, as it were, resolve the suspicion that Job's ruthless, as long as he's fine in himself, is to ensure that he no longer feels fine in himself. The Lord said to the Satan, very well, he is in your power, only spare his life. And here, sparing his life is not to be merciful, but it's so that Job can remain alive to respond to what happens. I mean, if it was just killing Job, you know, sort of push him off the edge of a cliff, well, 2 or 3 seconds in the air, and then splat hits the ground, that's the end. You know, it's too easy. You know, he's got to remain alive, but with his life no longer a delight or joy in any way to live. So the Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and inflicted loathsome sores on Job, from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And from the sole of the foot, the very bottom, to the crown of his head, the very top, means everywhere. There's no little sort of comfort zone, you know, it still feels okay. You know, the whole of Job is afflicted. And the Hebrew for the loathsome sores means not just that they're ugly, but they're burning, you know, sort of something sort of intensely painful and unpleasant. The whole of Job afflicted. Job took a potsherd with which to scrape himself and sat among the ashes. And see, note the appropriate sort of symbolism there. He sat among the ashes. What are ashes? Look at a tree, something beautiful and living, and items of furniture, of wood, you know, tables, chairs, covers, whatever, things that may be beautiful, useful. When they're reduced to ashes, there's nothing left. Nothing that's beautiful or useful anymore, just the remains of something that once was something. And Job's life, as it were, is now like that. So sitting among the ashes is the appropriate sort of place to sit. Everything's gone. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still persist in your integrity, your blamelessness? If this is what fearing God and being blameless is about, the game's not worth a candle. Be done with it. Curse God and die. Put an end to it all." But he said to her, "You speak as any foolish woman would speak." There's an issue of folly and wisdom here. "Shall we receive the good at the hand of God and not receive the bad?" Where Job's logic is very simple. It's no good being a fair weather friend. You're there with someone when times are good and easy, but when the times get tough, you say, "Sorry, out of here, bye." That's no friend. Or, putting it slightly differently, if you think about everything that Job has gone through in his relationship with God in the course of this narrative, if he still holds fast to God, his relationship with God, his fear of God, is for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health. And of course, those are the words that are definitive of love. That's why they come at the heart of the marriage service. That's what a true relationship of love looks like, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health. So, one or two final reflections. The story clearly presents us with a very stark kind of either God or self-interest. And, you know, put in that way, it is very stark, and you feel, you know, a bit like Jesus saying, you know, either God or mammon. And most of us feel, well, can't we manage a little bit of both? You know, a slightly more sort of compromised approach is very common. And, you know, most biblical figures wouldn't do particularly well. I mean, in the Old Testament, you know, sort of Jacob, who becomes Israel. You know, what kind of guy was he by that sort of criterion? And of course, many of us come to God with very mixed motives. But of course, part of the life of faith is a life of purifying our motives and our desires. We may come to God in self-seeking ways, but we need to learn to be less self-seeking, to learn to love God for himself, not for what we get out of God. But of course, once this question, the suspicion of being self-seeking has been raised, it remains an uncomfortable one, because of course we can, you know, look down our noses at prosperity gospel, you know, sort of the crude preaching, you know, come to God and he will bless you and make you wealthy. And say, well, of course, you know, that's, you know, not the true Christian gospel. We wouldn't want anything to do with something quite so crude as a prosperity gospel. But what if the self-seeking and what one is looking for is on a more spiritual level than a material one? Many of us will be familiar with, may have preached it ourselves. Do you want power and peace and purpose in your life? Then put your trust in God. Now, I'm not wanting to deny that there is indeed power and peace and purpose, and that these are good things, and many good things come in our life of faith. But do you see that it may be still a kind of self-seeking self-interest, simply of a more enlightened nature, a spiritual self-interest? But if we need to be weaned off such spiritual self-seeking, we're into God because it feels so good. How might that happen? Now, very briefly, all too briefly, this is where the famous notion of the dark night of the soul comes in. The Carmelite tradition was developed in the 16th century by St. Teresa of Avila, St. John of the Cross, and its 20th century interpreters, Merton, Ruth Burroughs, and others make this very clear, that there may be times when God, if we are in danger of being into God because it feels so good to be into God, that God may need to withdraw the sense of his presence, so that we learn to hang in there with God even when it's not feeling good and we're not getting anything out of it, so that, as it were, it can purify the relationship with God. And that, I oversimplify greatly, but I don't think I'm being unfair. It is, as it were, the dark night of the soul. A certain kind of, well, God withdrawing himself to purge and purify our relationship with him. And so you'll see that I've called this session God and the Logic of Love, because Job is held up here as someone who shows, in an Old Testament context, in its own way, the equivalent of what Christian faith wants to talk about, where on the one hand we trust in God's grace, which he gives freely, but that a faith that is not just self-interest, it should be the counterpart to that grace given freely, the response given freely, both being expressions of what love actually means and looks like.